video contains full spoilers for every version of Avatar: The Last Airbender. This video is part 2 to a video where I went over the first 4 episodes of the live-action Avatar: The Last Airbender remake and discussed the changes I liked, the changes I disliked, what was adapted well and what was adapted poorly. This video will cover episodes 5 to 8, but I highly recommend watching the first video first before you watch this one if you haven't already, because there are things from these last 4 episodes that I did either start talking about or even finish talking about in the first video. But with that out of the way, make sure to subscribe and let's begin, starting with episode 5, which is titled Spirited Away, named after the classic animated movie, and adapts a ridiculous amount of episodes. Primarily based on the Spirit World Part 1, The Winter Solstice, it takes elements from Jet and the Storm, The Siege of the North Part 1, and even later season episodes like The Swamp, The Library, and The Southern Raiders, and it's the episode that I think deviates the most from the original. There are a few negligible changes off the bat, like the Pippin Paddle-a-Cops, I can't say that, whatever that name is used in a completely different context, which was actually really unexpected and pretty funny. The girl Sokka says this to looks similar to the Fire Nation girl whose doll, life, and village he saved in the Jet episode, mostly because of the doll. I think it's cool they included these things after having not included them in the episodes they're from, because it does show an appreciation for the source material. For the Pippin Paddlecopolis, the third name, they did change it to make it a little bit more of a realistic scene, so I did definitely appreciate that as well. The first huge change is the reveal that Azula convinced Ozai to promote Zhao. Having Azula here from the start and being such a big part of Zhao's success sets her up really well as the brilliant and terrifying, like, secondary big bad she'll be in subsequent seasons, or the main villain of season 2. Azula's fire is also typically normal but turns blue at a certain point, which, while is different, I think it's a cool detail that could potentially add for some intense moments where Azula's flame turning blue holds more significance. Probably the single biggest deviation from the source material so far, and maybe in general, is that Katara and Sokka are brought to the spirit world alongside Aang, and then go on to relive terrible moments from their past. This storyline initially feels entirely original until you realize it's basically an adaptation of The Swamp from season 2, and it leads into Katara and Sokka being indisposed like they were in the spirit world, all in such a way that allows them to adapt Katara's backstory from the Southern Raiders in season 3, and add in new scenes involving Sokka that use the characters from the unadapted Bato of the Water Tribe episode. When it was going on, I was confused at how different it all was. It felt like a completely new story, but by the end of the episode, and especially after seeing episode 6, you realize that they pretty seamlessly stuck together like 6 different episodes from all 3 seasons and added new scenes, and I think that's pretty impressive. None of that is to say that these storylines were handled better or worse than the original, but I was very impressed at how they managed to pull something like this off at all. Certain characters or moments from The Fortune Teller, The Waterbending Scroll, and The Great Divide are all mentioned and referenced. This was a really funny moment that referenced many of the unadapted episodes, suggesting there are rumors being spread about the Avatar who's already become a bit of a celebrity, or maybe in between episodes they actually happened, albeit a little differently. There is a bit of a gap between episodes 4 and 5, and in between those episodes, all 3 of these episodes, again differently, could have easily happened. The spirit world never quite looked as different or mystical or even as good as the original series, which is a consequence of it being live action. The spirits, on the other hand, like Heibai, Ko, who appeared earlier in the season this time around, and Wang Shitong, who appeared a season early, all look absolutely fantastic. Ko was terrifying, and all of them had some seriously impressive CGI. I'm glad they included Heibai, and he looks super cool, but I do get why they changed the villain here to being Ko, who's far more evil and seems much more the type to terrorize a village. Aang did meet him unexpectedly this time around, so they were unable to include the zero emotions thing, and I'm fine with that. It did make for an intense scene in the show, but also, I kinda still don't believe Aang would be able to do that at all, even in the original series, and Ko managed to be just as creepy in this version without it, so they really did not need to include it. Wang Shitong appearing this early is very surprising, especially with him not being in his library. We also later learned that Zhao did not learn of the spirits from the library either, so it seems likely the library, unfortunately, will not exist in this version. They'll probably have to learn about the solar eclipse, and Appa will be kidnapped in a completely different way. I'll reserve my opinion on this change for season 2, although I think it's more likely to be a neutral or negative change than a positive one, because the library is a pretty great episode. If the library never gets adapted, it's possible they took the fox from that episode and replaced it in this episode with Yue, who in this version meets Sokka in the spirit world prior to them meeting in real life. This is inspired by Yue's appearance in the swamp. In that version, it was obviously after she died and became a moon spirit. It's only later revealed it's Yue in this scene, but it was pretty obvious. I do like this change. Yue is part spirit like an Avatar, so it makes sense she'd be able to enter the spirit world. It also allows her to appear earlier than the original, which works to give her more importance, especially in Sokka's story. Following Kiyoshi's lead, Gyatso steals from Roku again, who doesn't really appear much in this season compared to the original. Maybe he'll have a bigger role in season 2. In a completely new scene, Aang and Gyatso reunite in the spirit world one last time. In this touching scene that solidifies how much more significance this series gave Gyatso compared to the original, which isn't a knock against the original, either way is pretty much equally effective. Aang, however, is not told anything about the winter solstice, which is actually never brought up, and nothing about Sozin's comet or his destiny to defeat the Fire Lord, as the season takes a very different approach to his story and his mission. In this version of the Spirit World adaptation, the stakes feel smaller and more personal, but they do also feel a lot less important. It's a trade-off that I think would have worked really well if the relationships between Aang and the Water Tribe siblings were a little bit better established. As it stands, I do think it's a bit inferior to the original, but by no means bad. I never liked the idea that Aang needs to go to see Roku only on the winter solstice, because later talks between avatars always feel way easier to access, so I like that they got rid of that deadline. Sokka and Katara find themselves in the Fog of Lost Souls in this episode, a section of the spirit world that wasn't introduced until season 2 of Legend of Korra, and it's where Zhao went after he was taken by the ocean spirit. We'll see this kind of thing a few more times, but I absolutely love it whenever they reference added bits of lore that didn't yet exist in the original first season, especially if it's from way later like the comics or Korra. The next episode does this as well in a very significant way. Aang going off to the fire temple by himself, combined with the blue spirit episode where he was by himself, ends up working well for the episode, but again, the trio were not together nearly enough, as I talked about in depth in the first video. Either way, at first, I didn't love this episode, but again, after having seen episode 6, this episode is pretty good as well. Episode 6 is titled Masks. It adapts the Spirit World Part 2, Avatar Roku, the Storm, and the Blue Spirit, and is in my opinion, the single best episode of the season, perfectly adapting everything it sets out to adapt, while giving minimal and significant changes that almost exclusively serve to benefit the series. So off the bat, Roku has a lot smaller of a role in the season and is a bit more of a jokester. His dragon doesn't appear, and his appearance has to do with Ko for now, not Sozin or the comet. Again, the stakes feel smaller and more personal, but also less important. Gordon Conriere does give his most convincing performance in this episode, which sells the personal stakes far better than the previous. Roku's dragon not appearing is a money-saving no-brainer, but a disappointing one nonetheless. As previously mentioned, I love it when later added bits of lore are included, so the fact that Roku took a totem of the Mother of Faces from Ko, who is Ko's mother created for the sequel comics, and it's that Aang uses to save his friends and the villagers, is really cool. June, who was perfectly adapted in demeanor, look, and even the CGI of Nyla, I mean they nailed this character, is given a more significant role in this version of the series, at least in season 1, being the one to kidnap Aang instead of the Yuyan archers, which is a change I like. I really just wanted to take this opportunity to praise the perfect adaptation of June. Speaking of perfect adaptations, the entire Blue Spirit rescue of Aang is like beat for beat, the exact same as the show. The mask looks identical, the shots and choreography are perfectly adapted, Zuko is badass with swords, Aang has some of his best airbending moments in fight scenes, and the two working together is so cool. Literally nothing's changed here, and goddamn, did they knock this whole sequence out of the park. It's one of the reasons this is the best episode of the season. The main changes in the Blue Spirit storyline come after they escape, expanding the conversation between Zuko and Aang. This scene shows Aang trying to reach the compassionate side of Zuko that's been so suppressed by his father, and Zuko's reaction is somehow still shocking and intense despite the fact that we basically already know everything there is to know about this character. The scene is very well acted by Dallas Liu and is some of Gordon's best acting as well, and it connects so well to the Zuko flashback we see right after. It also does a great job at showing Aang's people skills. I have seen people complain online that they talked about how good Aang is with people but didn't show it. it. You don't really need to look past this one scene to see Aang's caring, compassionate, and heartfelt nature and how he reaches out to Zuko, and you could even see him breaking through a bit to Zuko until he says the word compassion, and Zuko loses it, and we find out why right after. Like the Blue Spirit scenes, this episode also nailed absolutely everything regarding Zuko's backstory from the storm, the war room meeting, defending the 41st Division, and the reveal that he's fighting Ozai. It was all so well done. The episode then expands on what the original did by actually showing us a full Agni Kai, instead of Zuko not fighting back, which is, again, a change I've seen people complaining about. I don't mind at all, especially since Ozai was demanding he fight back. And it's brutal. Ozai comes off as a terrifying, cold-hearted monster justifying the abuse of his son. The fight choreography is exciting, the bending looks great, and the scarring of Zuko, twice actually, is intense. The Agni Kai not really being shown in the original worked, but this worked just as well and justifies there not being an Agni Kai between Zuko and Zhao earlier on like the original. I really like this scene. The iconic line from the original Agni Kai is, "You will learn respect and suffering will be your teacher," which connects to Zuko not respecting his crew. Here, it's changed to "compassion is a sign of weakness," which is a more cliche villain line, but also connects, I think, a little bit better to Zuko's warped mindset in regards to his crew, his conversation with Aang, and his own conflicting morality. The line is not as cool, but it is, I think, more effective for Zuko. And of course, speaking of Zuko's crew, it's with them we get what I think is the single best addition this show made to the lore, the reveal that Zuko's crew is the 41st Division, the same division he defended in the War Council, the division he was scarred and banished over, and the division whose lives he saved. I absolutely love this. It's such a simple yet extraordinarily effective twist that further cements Zuko's character and does a better job than the original, I think, of convincing the crew to forgive his disrespectful behavior. And then what it leads to, with Zuko returning and then Lieutenant G saying "Our prince has returned" with the music in the background, it's one of the best scenes of the show. Speaking of Lieutenant G, he also had a scene early in the episode where he pours out his frustrations regarding Zuko to Iroh, and it's genuinely some of the best acting on the show. Between him and the Earth Nation soldier from episode 4, there's a lot of very minor characters being given better writing and acting than the main characters, because the main characters are kids, the acting isn't as good, which isn't great for the main characters, but does make for some standout moments that does very much help the world feel more alive and populated by actual real people, who aren't just background characters, which is especially true for Lieutenant G. Lieutenant G is a far more fleshed out and three-dimensional character than the original. Like in the original series, Zhao takes control of Zuko's crew, meaning it could be probably assumed that they all died at the hands of the Ocean Spirit and Aang at the end, like in the original series, since they never appeared after that. In the original series, you don't really care because the crew, or at least Lieutenant G, isn't really much of a character outside of really just one episode, The Storm. In this series, just the prospect that Lieutenant G died is pretty sad to me. I honestly wouldn't mind it if they revealed that maybe he escaped, and then maybe he could return in like season 3 to help Team Avatar fight the Fire Nation. Maybe instead of one of the characters from a cut episode, like if it never gets adapted, then Haru will never appear. Maybe he could replace him. I would actually love that because the actor is great, the character was so much better than the original. I love this episode. Even in the original season 1, I would consider it one of the better episodes of that season. The next episode, however, is my least favorite episode of the season. Episode 7 is titled The North and adapts the Waterbending Master primarily, with elements from The Siege of the North Part 1, like one scene from Part 2, and also elements from Sozin's Combat the Old Masters, like episode 2 where he talked to Kyoshi. Here, he talks to Kuruk. Kuruk is another bit of lore that didn't exist yet when the original season was being made, and talked to the previous Firebender and previous Earthbender avatars in this version of the season. Here in the Northern Water Tribe, it would have felt like a big missed opportunity if he didn't complete the set. Kuruk also later allows for a bit of simplification towards Aang finding out about the ocean and Moon Spirit, while also helping explain how Zhao was able to kill the Moon Spirit in this version, which is something that I always found very weird with the original, the fact that the ocean and the Moon Spirit simply gave up their immortality, and anyone could have just shown up at any time and just killed them them like they kill any fish. In this version, and I think they fixed it here, they gave up their immortality for just one night a year under what is called the Ice Moon, and Zhao had to use Kurik's special spirit dagger to kill it, a very specific situation that cannot be easily replicated. All of that is to say that I think they improved on that aspect of the series by including Kurik, who's more connected to the water tribe than Ko, and is well versed in the spirits. They were both able to simplify Aang learning about the spirits while also making the whole situation feel more believable and not easily replicated, and that worked extremely well. Backing up a bit, Zhao does not hire pirates to attempt to kill Zuko, instead either doing it himself or maybe by having an inside man on his ship. Seeing as the pirates didn't appear this season, it would have been jarring if they were to have been hired here, and it's relatively unnecessary. A very noticeable change is that Han is like a completely different character. He's far more admirable and respectable and competent, which is a change that definitely lowers the comedy of the character, but does make his death in the finale feel a lot more significant. They made a point of having him and that guy that Katara interacted with both being seen dead to up the destruction of the Northern Water Tribe and how that affected Aang, and that worked very well. I already talked about the change dynamic between Ozai and Azula in the previous video, but it comes to a head here, with Azula basically becoming the Azula from season 2 and onwards by proving herself to her father, demanding respect with a powerful display of lightning bending, the first time we see it in the show, which was an awesome moment. I especially loved Ozai's smile as if he got exactly what he wanted. It, again, like I mentioned in the previous video, solidified that the family dynamic isn't actually all that different. It's just that Ozai demands a little bit more from Azula to prove herself, and that's a change I very much like. I didn't think I would appreciate Azula's inclusion in the season as much as I did, nor did I think I'd like Ozai forcing her to earn his respect this time around this much, but I think it served to set both characters up as more three-dimensional and better developed. On paper, it definitely works better for Pakku to be convinced by Katara and the women of the Northern Water Tribe's bravery, instead of simply realizing that Katara is the love of his life's granddaughter, which is something that's completely removed. However, that is on paper. I like the fact that they got rid of that, but Katara's acting, writing, and characterization was just nowhere near as good as the original, so the whole story arc just didn't land nearly as well here. That being said, I do think it's in this episode and in the next one where Katara is closest to her true personality, so maybe she's just becoming more confident and standing up for herself a bit more. Here's hoping they'll continue to improve into season 2. This episode was almost entirely set up and not exactly executed amazingly. The finale is titled Legends and adapts the Siege of the North Part 1 and Part 2. To start things off, the scene where Iroh and Zuko depart goes mostly the same, except the line where Iroh says he always thought of Zuko as his own, to which Zuko replied, "I know," is replaced by Zuko saying, "Liu Ten would have been proud to have you as a father," which in a vacuum is a great and very effective line, but in comparison to the original, it's not quite as good. I was really looking forward to hearing that in this version. Maybe they'll get back to it later. Afterwards, Zuko's role in the episode was lesser in parts, but better in others. We don't see him swimming into the city, he doesn't defeat Katara, doesn't kidnap Aang, and doesn't get stuck in the blizzard, most of which was removed because Aang simply didn't go into the spirit world to meet Ko. This was initially disappointing, especially because I associate Zuko getting stuck in the snowstorm so strongly to Iroh's speech in season 2 before Zuko let Appa go, where he says he had Aang in the snow and had nowhere to go. My disappointment, however, was pretty much completely mitigated. For one, the fight between Zuko and Katara was pretty good, but also the final confrontation between Zuko and Zhao was fantastic. Not necessarily the fight, it was way too short. It was good, but very short. It's really the reveal to Zuko that his banishment was a sham. It was, initially at least, a wild goose chase that was used to simply motivate Azula, and that she was Zhao's ally through all of this. This was a great moment. It brought Azula's machinations, her scenes with Ozai, and the Zuko flashbacks all together. Zuko's reaction and the acting was fantastic, and it already set up a bit of a rivalry between the siblings, even though they have like no scenes together in this season. You might have noticed I've been praising Zuko more than anyone else in these videos, and it's because he is absolutely the character they handled the best. Between his writing, Dallas Liu's acting, adapting everything perfectly, and every addition to the character fitting perfectly, Zuko was done absolute justice, even before his incredible redemption arc. The war balloons come into play far earlier this time around, as Zhao uses it to get himself, Iroh, and his men into the oasis, instead of simply using the attack as a distraction, which is a nice little addition that makes a lot of sense. It will mean that the war balloons inclusion in the Day of the Black Sun won't be surprising, but that's a very small change, and that's way down the line. In my opinion, they did the big ocean monster that Aang turns into decently well, but definitely not up to par with the original. It was on screen for less time than I would have liked, and the biggest problem is that it did more growling than attacking, which was very frustrating to watch. He's not a big monster. He shouldn't be growling. He's like a fish and a human combined. He should just be attacking. That was frustrating, but the sheer scale of the thing, the visuals, the impact, and its power were all nailed. The big change here is that Aang gave himself over to the ocean spirit, that Aang essentially sacrificed his life to become this monster, and would have been lost forever had Yue not sacrificed her life as well, which I guess could be inferred from the original season, but it was not confirmed. This was a nice added detail that I think adds a bit more weight to these events. It also connects a bit better to Aang feeling out of time, as he mentions in the scene, and Aang emerging with other spirits to reach this level of power again down the line definitely seems like a less valid option this time around, because it would basically be meaning that Aang is sacrificing his life. I really like the fact that Omashu was captured on screen this time around. In the original, it was an amazing twist in the beginning of season 2, but we know what's happening, so I'm glad they put it on screen. I'm neutral on it being Azula who did it, since on one hand, in the original, she goes on to capture Ba Sing Se, and this might lessen the impact of that, while on the other hand, it's the perfect follow-up to Azula asking to be let loose on the world by Ozai. The idea that the invasion of the North was a distraction is something I'm less sure about. I'm not sure exactly how one thing help the other, and I guess it does kind of lessen the importance of the siege and of Aang saving all of them, but I would say that's maybe just a nitpick. I'll kind of form my opinion on this over time and as we see the later 2 seasons. And finally, after having avoided it as a plot point throughout the season, Sozin's comment is only now in an end credit scene brought up in the very last scene of the season, set to be coming soon in an intentionally vague way. I guess, yeah, compared to 100 years, 3 years is pretty soon if that's when it comes. I already mentioned my thoughts on how Sozin's comment being omitted as a plot point affected the season in the first video, but I will say I'm glad they did at least set it up here. I think it works very well. This episode wasn't quite up to the standards of the original finale, but still a really great episode. Having gone episode by episode, I never mentioned some generalities regarding this show, such as the music, which I thought was fantastic. It incorporated all the amazing and iconic music of the original series while also adding in some new stuff, and best of all, Korra music. The music from the original series is iconic, but for me personally, the music from Korra is my favorite. It's just, in my opinion, a bit better. So whenever I heard the music from Korra, such as in the intros of each episode, it was really cool. I thought the costumes were mostly really great, at least for the most part, certainly for the Fire Nation and Air Nomads. The biggest issue with the costumes is in the Water Tribe costumes. They weren't the best. The Southern Water Tribe outfits were too tailor-made and clean. They looked good, but not authentic. They don't look like they were made out of animal skin, so I do think that that could have been a little bit better. The Northern Water Tribe costumes were also mostly the same. Yue's wig, though, is distractingly fake looking. And finally, having collected the ratings of each episode, the seasonal average is 8.375, but since I don't like decimals in my ratings, and because as a whole, the season is slightly worse than the sum of its parts, mostly due to how undercooked the main trio's relationships were, I'd round that down to an 8. Obviously, this show was never going to reach the heights of the original, and it failed at adapting certain things, but I would say either through recontextualizing certain events, merging stories together, adding new details, and adapting most things well, the live-action Avatar: The Last Airbender, in my opinion, cemented its place in the Avatar franchise as an alternate take that both sets itself apart and respects the source material. I really don't get the hate, especially after the recent Percy Jackson series, which is way worse than this. This is miles better in comparison, and after all that, I'm genuinely excited for season 2. I can't wait to see what changes they're going to make, what episodes they're going to merge together, and how well they could adapt everything. I will say though, Toph sounds like a borderline impossible character to adapt into live action. Let's see if they pull it off.